everyone. It has been a minute. Since my last video, have had a child and just been quite busy, so I haven't uploaded a video in a while, but I have some fun news. I'm actually working on a book. The book is called Breaking Epistemic Ties, A Defense of Permissivism as a tentative title. I'm in the very early stages of working on it. So what I want to do here is sort of summarize some of kind of the main lines of argument from the book. Obviously, this is going to be a short presentation, and it's probably going to be a pretty long book. I think maybe 11 or 12 chapters. So this is just going to kind of summarize some of the main things I want to talk about and explore in the book, and kind of some of the preliminary arguments I'm sort of working through in this book. Okay, so let's just jump in. A common thought I think a lot of epistemologists have, and people in general, is that what's epistemically rational for you to believe depends on your evidence. And this sounds nice. It's like, yeah, follow your evidence. That's what's epistemically rational. This is kind of the driving thought behind evidentialism, which is a very common theory of epistemic rationality. But I think even if you embrace this basic idea, that doesn't mean epistemology is just this like simple, easy thing. And part of that is because of the nature of evidence. So I don't think that evidence, I don't think it's as simple and straightforward as some evidentialists make it sound, because evidence can be limited, it can be complicated, it can be misleading, and it might not always clearly point us in a single direction. So if we're trying to use evidence to decide what to believe, that's not always going to just say, oh, believe this or don't believe that. I mean, sometimes I think it will, but I don't think it always does. And so I kind of want to make this general thought a little bit more precise and argue that even the rational evidence follower is going to encounter what I call epistemic ties. And so I'm going to give some arguments for the existence of epistemic ties, and then I'm going to provide a suggestion for how we might break epistemic ties. Cool. This is related to some previous videos that I've made, but I think it's a little bit more refined and concise, and then I'm actually giving some new arguments here as well. So if you have watched previous videos, you might notice some connections, but this is sort of my latest thinking about these matters. So the first question I want to address is the question of what are epistemic ties. So to embrace the existence of epistemic ties is to embrace a form of what's known as epistemic permissivism, which is I think a popular view among philosophers, although controversial, and a number of philosophers argue for impermissivism, or also what's known as uniqueness. So here, when I'm thinking about the idea that two attitudes towards a proposition are epistemically tied, what I'm thinking this means is that they're both equally rational, given some body of evidence. Okay, so to make things even more controversial and sort of make that thought even more explicit, the type of epistemic ties that I'm going to argue for that I think exist involve a single person and her evidence. So this is intrapersonal permissivism. It's not just that two people who share evidence can disagree, but it's that a single person and her evidence, sometimes there's two attitudes for her that are epistemically tied. And I'm also focusing on the belief attitudes, so belief, withholding, and disbelief. I'm not talking about ties among credences, but I think that for a single person and her evidence, belief and withholding, or belief and withholding and disbelief, or disbelief and withholding, that they could be epistemically tied for her. And like I said, I'm either thinking about two attitudes, withholding would normally be one of them, or all three attitudes. And I'm also thinking about these ties occurring at a particular time, rather than like over time, maybe when some non-evidential factor changes. So some people argue that you could be epistemically rational to believe and then withhold when your evidence stays fixed over time, but not at a time. And so here I'm thinking about a synchronic version of permissivism, where at a time, multiple belief attitudes could be rational for a single person and her evidence, and that's kind of holding the proposition in question fixed. Okay, so that's epistemic ties, and I want to like basically first argue for the existence of epistemic ties, and I'll say too, not only do I think they exist, I actually think they're kind of a common thing. So I'm not necessarily going to argue that they're common here, but I'll give some examples that kind of motivate that. But I think I'll have succeeded in my goal if I at least convince you that epistemic ties sometimes occur. Okay, So there's 4 arguments for epistemic ties, and specifically the kind of ties that I'm thinking about, this syncretic interpersonal belief ties. Um, the first one is actually a pretty common one that a number of people have noticed in literature that supports permissivism. And this is self-justifying beliefs. I actually made another video about this as well, and the connection between self-justifying attitudes and faith. But self-justifying beliefs are basically cases where if you form a belief that some proposition is true, that's either going to make the proposition true, or it'll at least make the proposition much more likely to be true. So there's like a silly example where God comes to you and says, if you believe it's raining in New York City right now, I will make sure it rains in New York City right now. So there's those kinds of cases, but there's also actually some interesting cases that are actually supported by some literature in psychology, where having a certain level of confidence in yourself actually makes it more likely that the thing you're kind of being confident in will happen. Whether that's I'm confident I'll win this basketball game, or I'm confident this date will go well, or I'm confident that I'll give a good speech. And so what's interesting about these self-justifying beliefs is they actually do support this sort of synchronic interpersonal permissivism, because sort of given your evidence, it seems like belief could be rational, because you would get evidence for P upon believing P, or even you have reason to think that believing P would make P true, whereas disbelieving P, same thing, that would make not P true. These are more just kind of like interesting cases to think about, but I don't think they're going to be the main ones I'm thinking about here, but they do support the kind of epistemic ties I'm thinking about. Okay. Second argument is what I call the evidence trickle argument. This is actually pioneered by Blake Raber. I think Blake calls these equipolant cases, but I like the evidence trickle thought. And let me just start with a basic case. So I call this case the eye chart case. So let's say you're getting your eyes tested at the doctor's office. The top couple lines you can very easily read. You can see what the letters are. There's a big E at the top, but the bottom couple lines are a complete blur. So you have no clue what the letters on the bottom couple lines are. As you read down the chart, there's a line at which you can mostly make out the letters. You have a good guess as to what they are, but for some of the letters, you're kind of doubting whether you're saying them correctly. Is that a D or is that a P? And so the thought is your evidence is really good at the top, and it slowly gets really bad. And at the bottom, you should withhold belief on what the letters are, and at the top, you should believe what the letters are. But at some point in the middle, it's going to be rational for you to either form beliefs about what the letters are or withhold belief. So in this case, believing that is a D would be epistemically tied with withholding belief that that's a D. That's just one example. Let me give one more, and then I'll sort of give the more general form of the argument. Walking slowly towards a road sign would be another example of this. So when you're really, really far away, the sign is super blurry, you have no idea what it says. You slowly walk towards it, and when you're 2 feet in front of it, you can clearly read the sign. Maybe it says exit 35 or something. At that point, you ought to believe the sign says exit 35. And at the beginning, when you were like really far back and can barely even see the sign, you should withhold belief that says exit 35. And the thought is, at some point, if you're walking slowly enough, belief and withholding that the sign says exit 35 are both going to be rationally available to you, given your evidence. They're going to be epistemically tied. So here's the general thought. Sometimes our evidence gradually improves. This is why it's called the evidence trickle argument. It improves from a situation where you're rationally required to withhold belief to a situation where you're rationally required to believe the proposition in question. And if this happens, there's going to be some point at which your evidence actually equally supports both belief and withholding. So if this is the case, it seems like those two attitudes will be epistemically tied, and either one would be equally rational for you to adopt. I'll also note that there could also be cases where you start off believing and then your evidence slowly gets worse, and then you're required to withhold belief. It would be a similar kind of epistemic tie, but just in the reverse direction. Then there could also be cases where this happens with disbelieving too. Okay, so that's argument number 2. Then argument number 3 kind of is appealing to the limitations of evidence. So the thought here is, well, sometimes our evidence towards a proposition very clearly supports a proposition. 1 + 1 = 2, there's a desk in front of me. Like, those things are extremely likely to be true given my evidence. But sometimes things are just a lot more complicated. Sometimes our evidence is really limited, or it's just really complicated, and it's not obvious that our evidence supports a certain, like, having a certain attitude towards a proposition, or that supports the truth of a certain proposition. So you might think about like just like common controversial issues that are highly debated. So whether and when euthanasia is morally permissible, what type of government is best, what theories are true in epistemology or in metaphysics. Um, in these cases, I think there's interesting arguments on both sides. And I think part of the reason that these are so controversial is because for a lot of us, given our body of evidence, the evidence does not objectively support one position over the other. So here I'm thinking of controversies in politics, in morality, in religion. These are cases where our evidence is just limited or complicated. Here's a concrete case. If you've seen Making a Murderer, you might resonate with this case. So let's say you're part of a jury for a murder trial and you're trying to decide if Stephen is guilty. So there's a decent case to be made that Stephen did it based on an eyewitness testimony. But also there's some evidence that the eyewitness was manipulated, and the local police have a clear motive to frame Stephen for the crime. But on the other hand, framing Stephen would have required very careful work. So there's bone fragments that were found in Stephen's backyard, and his DNA was found in the victim's car. And there's also another serial killer who is a suspect and who could have been the one who did it. The victim fits the profile, and the serial killer was thought to be in the area at the time. So what am I saying? The evidence is complicated. It's limited, it's complicated. People debate about whether Steven Avery committed this crime incessantly on the internet, like go on Reddit or whatever. I know this is like a couple years old, but I think it's a good illustration of this. And so I would say, look, as a juror on this murder trial, given this really complicated evidence, it could be rational for you to believe that Stephen's guilty. It could be rational for you to withhold belief and not really form a judgment either way, or it could be rational for you to disbelieve that Stephen's guilty and instead believe that the other serial killer did it. And so this is a case where belief, withholding, and disbelief on Stephen's guilt, they're all epistemically tied. That's my contention. Okay. And so then the thought is, well, look, sometimes the evidence is limited or complicated. This suggests that the evidence doesn't always rationalize a single attitude towards proposition. When it's limited, I think sometimes that means we just, given our current evidence, we don't have enough evidence for it to point to a single rational attitude. So, we can take a stand given the evidence, but because it's limited, we're not really forced to take one attitude. And when it's complicated, it suggests that even if we have a lot of evidence, there's not a single attitude that it clearly supports. So multiple responses are rationally available, and hence epistemic ties occur. Okay, the last argument for epistemic ties has to do with IBE, which is inference to the best explanation. And interestingly, when you think about what IBE says, it says, well, we should infer that the best explanation is the thing that explains the evidence. So go outside and it's wet, you infer it rained. It's the best explanation of the evidence. But I think there's something a little bit misleading about this title, or at least it doesn't fully capture all the cases, because I don't think there's always one best explanation. I think in some cases, yeah, maybe there is, but I think in a lot of cases, there's several equally good explanations of the evidence. Okay, so some of our examples, again, I think will apply here, like these disputed court cases. Stephen committed the crime, or the serial killer committed the crime. Deep philosophical disagreements, moral, political, or religious controversies. I think these are all cases where there could be several equally good explanations that are all at the top. So there's not sort of one explanation that's uniquely best, but several equally good explanations. And one case that I think is really interesting that could illustrate this is a case from Peter Van Inwagen, where Peter actually explains his decision to become a theist. And Peter was kind of in a place where he was re-examining his beliefs about God. He was feeling torn about what to believe. And he said, on the one hand, he could see the world as sort of independent and uncreated. But on the other hand, he could see the world as something that's dependent on or sustained by a being that's outside of the world. So, I'm sure Peter was aware of like the arguments for God's existence on the one hand, but also like the challenges to the existence of God, like the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. And so what's interesting is that Peter said when he was kind of at this moment of kind of re-examining his beliefs about God, he could actually sort of switch between these two explanations of the evidence, these two ways of seeing the world at will, kind of like in a duck rabbit fashion, so that that picture where you can see a duck and then you can see a rabbit. He said he could sort of move between these two explanations of evidence. And at the time, I think he probably viewed them both as equally good, as both quite good explanations of the evidence. And he eventually settled on the theistic one. But I think theism or certain religious controversies could also be an example of this. And I'll have some chapters later in the book where I go into that in more detail and kind of defend that. But then the thought is, look, okay, so sometimes there's these multiple equally good explanations of the evidence, then it can be rational to believe either explanation, and they're mutually exclusive. So what that means is that if you accept one, you should reject the other. And so this would be a case of an epistemic tie where belief, withholding, and disbelief would all be rationally available to you. Okay. Very briefly, I want to consider an objection, and that's this worry that, well, let's take a case where there's an epistemic tie and maybe there's multiple equally good explanations of the evidence, or my evidence is just limited or complicated. Shouldn't I just withhold belief? Like, for one thing, let's say my evidence is limited. Well, maybe I should just wait until my evidence gets better and withhold belief, not taking a stance yet. Or if there's like a bunch of equally good explanations, why should I pick one? Shouldn't I be cautious? And I guess I have 3 responses. I think this is a good objection, but there's sort of 3 responses to it. The first is that I think this could actually lead to quite a bit of skepticism and not being able to have a lot of beliefs that we think we should be able to have. So this is because I think cases of limited and complicated evidence, or cases where there's multiple equally good explanations, are actually a relatively common feature of our lives. So, let's say you're deciding, what bus should I take in light of road work? Looking at the monitor, is my son awake or is he just stirring? Which late policy is best for my students? These are like all things I've thought about in the past couple days, right? I encounter limited and complicated evidence. And so I would have to withhold belief on like a lot of everyday beliefs, not just controversial matters, or it's not just this like limited skepticism. It would be like a relatively widespread skepticism. And so I think, given that I think believing a lot of these things can be rational, I don't know that we want to say that we should always withhold belief in cases of epistemic ties. Okay. The second response has to do with this insight that William James had. I love William James, and I think this is like a really, really cool point, which is that when it comes to epistemology, we have 2 epistemic goals we have to balance between each other. And the first goal is to believe truths. We want to have true beliefs, but we also want to avoid error. So we don't want to have tons of false beliefs. But these balance against each other, because we could just believe everything, having lots of true beliefs, but then we'd also have tons of false beliefs. We could believe nothing and we wouldn't have any false beliefs. We also would miss out on the true beliefs. And so we have to kind of strike a balance between these 2 goals. And if you say, well, look, I have to withhold belief every time my evidence is limited or complicated, or when there's not a clearly best explanation, what this seems to be doing is it's prioritizing avoiding error over believing truths. And it's not clear that we should care more about avoiding error than we should believing truths. Maybe we should weigh them equally or roughly equally. I mean, I'm not going to take a stand on that here, but the point is that we're kind of forgetting one epistemic goal and putting much more emphasis on the other if you're just saying to withhold belief in all cases of epistemic ties. And of course, I acknowledge that there's going to be a risk involved in believing an explanation when you know there are other equally good explanations out there. But if you simply withhold belief, there's 100% chance that you're going to miss out on a true belief. And I also just want to remind you too that I'm not saying withholding belief is irrational. I'm not saying you have to believe. I'm just saying that if you want to go ahead and take a little bit of an epistemic risk and believe, you're well within your epistemic rights to do so. So believing is not irrational, withholding isn't irrational either. All right. The final response is very quick, and that's just this idea that in cases of moderate permissivism, where your evidence is balanced between belief and withholding or disbelief in withholding, such as the evidence trickle argument, it's not going to be at all clear withholding belief is going to be the default, because it's going to be balanced between believing and withholding. So why would you pick one of those over the other when the evidence is balanced between those two? So this idea that we should just withhold belief in cases of epistemic ties isn't really going to have, I think, much purchase or much weight in cases where you're really choosing between withholding and one other attitude. Okay. Now what I want to do is talk about the question, how do you break an epistemic tie? And I think this is kind of a fun upshot of believing in epistemic ties, but I also think it can be viewed as a indirect argument for epistemic ties because it can kind of help us carve a middle way between these two sort of opposing positions in epistemology. Okay, so one recent really big debate in epistemology is the debate between purists and impurists. Purists say epistemic rationality is only affected by truth-relevant factors like evidence or maybe reliability, those kinds of things. Impurists, on the other hand, they say that epistemic rationality can be affected by non-truth relevant things, so practical factors. An example of this would be the pragmatic encroachment cases. I have other videos on that. Then there's moral encroachment, so, cases where morality seems like it could affect epistemic rationality, for example, like a sexist or racist belief. The thought would be even if you have really good evidence for something, if it's sexist or racist, you shouldn't believe it. And then there's also epistemic partiality, which says that we can believe different things of our friends and family, or at least hold them to different standards of evidence than we would strangers. So there might be a certain amount of evidence that I need to believe that Smith committed some crime when Smith is some stranger. But if I had that same amount of evidence, I shouldn't believe that like my brother committed some crime. And that doesn't we're holding the evidence fixed. So it's not because I know more about my brother. That's not the reason. It's because of the closeness of my relationship to my brother. Okay. So the thought is practical factors, moral factors, closeness of relationship, they can all affect epistemic rationality. That's what the empirists say. But the purists, they push back on that. And I think here's at least two worries that a purist might raise to these sorts of empirism. The first is like kind of just this like purist intuition is what I call it. But I think there's something to be said for this. And that's this question, how can these non-truth related factors really affect epistemic rationality, right? This is supposed to be truth-focused, knowledge-focused rationality, and it doesn't really seem right to say that a practical thing or a moral thing or how close a relationship is can affect that. That's kind of defeating the purpose for what we mean by epistemic rationality. So that's the first problem. And then the second problem is, well, how far do we take this? So if we say a practical factor can come in and affect what someone should believe, like if all your evidence supports P, can that practical factor make it rational for you to believe not P? So that's one question, like how much can it change our attitude towards a particular proposition? A second question is how many of the propositions that we have attitudes to can it change? So can it change like all of our attitudes or just some of them? So how far do we take this? That's a scope question. And what I think is this idea that if we bring in epistemic ties, it can actually help us a lot with both of these problems, but it can also, so it can kind of give us a more moderate version of empirism, but there's also a sort of version of this view I think purists can adopt as well. So here's my suggestion. My suggestion is that non-epistemic factors, such as practical factors, moral factors, and closeness of relationship, they can break epistemic ties. And more specifically, this non-epistemic stuff can make a difference to epistemic rationality only when you already have an epistemic tie. So it can't make me believe not P if my evidence clearly supports P. But if my evidence is tied between withholding and believing, or withholding, believing and disbelieving, or disbelieving and withholding, then a non-epistemic factor like a practical factor could tell me to choose belief rather than withholding, or tell me to choose disbelief rather than withholding, or to withhold belief. And so I think what's cool about this is that it can give the epistemic stuff the first say. So the epistemic has the priority when it comes to justified belief. And I think this helps with the purist intuition. So practical and moral factors, they can never force us to go against our evidence. They can never make an unjustified belief rational. And in cases where there's one single rational attitude given our evidence, practical and moral stuff just isn't going to come into play. But if the evidence kind of leaves open what to believe, then this non-epistemic stuff, they can help us choose between two equally rational attitudes. And I think that's kind of cool. Okay. Also, this can help with the scope question. So the extent to which practical and moral factors can affect epistemic rationality is going to just fully depend on the extent to which epistemic rationality is permissive, and more specifically, which attitudes are rationally available to us. And in cases where epistemic rationality is not permissive, whether that's it doesn't allow me to disbelieve P given my evidence, or whether that's like the range of propositions that it's not permissive over, um, then it's going to say, look, if it's not permissive over like these range of propositions, then the non-epistemic stuff can't make a difference. If disbelieving is not rationally available to you, then it can't make disbelieving epistemically rational. So I think this kind of helps with the scope question. And this also shows sort of why this is a more moderate view, because some empirists want to say that like, given like the stakes are really, really, really high, you should withhold belief on a proposition like your birthplace. Like I was born in Lawrence, Kansas, that say, well, if someone gives you a bet and they say, you're going to be tortured forever if you're born in Lawrence, Kansas, and I'll give you $10 if you weren't, or wait, sorry, I'll give you $10 if you were born in Lawrence, Kansas, and if you weren't born in Lawrence, Kansas, I'm going to torture you forever. The empirist would say, well, you shouldn't take that bet. You should withhold belief that you're born in Lawrence, Kansas. But I'm going to say no, like I can continue to believe I'm born in Lawrence, Kansas because my evidence for that is so good that it's not a permissive case. So those kind of high stakes scenarios can only make a difference in cases where my evidence is already permissive, where there's already an epistemic tie. So I'd say basically in these kind of extreme cases, the non-epistemic stuff just can't make that much of a difference. So it kind of limits the empirism in a way that I think is really helpful. And I think you can kind of make this work on an empirist or a purist view, and that's just going to depend on whether the non-epistemic stuff is affecting epistemic rationality in the cases of epistemic ties, or whether it's sort of affecting all things considered rationality in the case of epistemic ties. But either way, the suggestion holds, non-epistemic factors can help break epistemic ties, and then whether that's purist or empirist is going to depend on whether the non-epistemic stuff affects epistemic rationality. All right, cool. So that's kind of the main stuff I had. Hopefully I'll be able to make some future videos on sort of how this book is going to deal with some of the philosophy of religion stuff. So I'll have some chapters on faith, the problem of evil, and Pascal's wager at the end of the book. And so I think I'll make some future videos on that. But this is kind of a summary of some of the main arguments from the beginning of the book. So I hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you all later.